Good evening. When you hear me open my mouth and the first words that come out of my mouth, you're probably wondering, how is this guy with the American accent some type of enemy of the state of Russia? And so I'd like to tell you my story, which goes back a number of decades. I am indeed American. I was born in New Jersey, brought up in Chicago, but I come from a very unusual American family. My grandfather, Earl Browder, was from Wichita, Kansas, and he was a labor union organizer in the 1920s. And he was so good at organizing the union that the communists spotted him from Russia. And they said, if you like labor unionism, you're going to love communism. Why don't you come and check it out? And so in 1927, my grandfather went to Moscow, and then he did what every American male, single American male does when they get to Moscow. He met a Russian girl who became my grandmother. My father was born there. And then in 1932, he was sent back to America to become head of the American Communist Party. He ran for president twice on the communist ticket in 1936 and 1940 against Roosevelt. He was then imprisoned by Roosevelt in 1940 and then pardoned in 1941. He was then kicked out of the Communist Party for being too much of a capitalist in 1945, and then persecuted in the 1950s by McCarthy for being too much of a communist. So this is my family legacy. I was born in 1964. I'm 51 years old. But when I was going through my teenage rebellion in the 1970s, I was trying to figure out some way to rebel from my family of communists. And I tried the normal rebellion techniques. I grew my hair into an afro. That didn't seem to upset my parents. I followed the Grateful Dead around the country. That also didn't upset my parents. But then I came up with this great rebellion technique which did upset them, which was to put on a suit and tie and become a capitalist. So I became a capitalist, and I went to Stanford Business School. And I graduated business school in 1989, which was a very significant year because that was the year that the Berlin Wall came down. And so, as many young MBAs, I was looking to try to figure out what I could do that would be a meaningful job in my life. And none of the normal recruiting on campus moved me. And I was really having a hard time trying to figure out what to do. And then until one day I had this epiphany, which was, if my grandfather was the biggest communist in America and the Berlin Wall has just come down, I'm going to set out to become the biggest capitalist in Eastern Europe. So it wasn't as if there was a lot of capitalism going on in Eastern Europe after the Berlin Wall came down. And my first job coming out of business school was with the Boston Consulting Group in London. And I went there because they said to me that if they ever get any Eastern European business, I could be their guy. So I go there to London. I start working in their office. And one day, about 6 months after I arrived there, there's a knock on my door, and the guy in charge of the office said, "You're the guy who wanted to work in Eastern Europe, right?" And I said, "Yeah." And he said, "Well, we got something for you now." And so they had this assignment where there's a bus company in the southeast corner of Poland on the Ukrainian border. And the bus company had sold all its buses to the state of Poland, and they stopped buying the buses. And so all of their sales had dried up. And so the World Bank had hired the Boston Consulting Group at a very, very small fee to try to figure out what to do with this bus company. And since BCG couldn't afford to send anybody else out, they sent a first-year associate out by myself to advise this poor bus company. So I get out to Poland, and it's really a mess out there at the time. They had just gone from communism to capitalism, and there was hyperinflation. The telephones didn't work. There was no heating in the buildings. Food shortages and all sorts of other stuff. And it was a very unpleasant experience, and it was particularly unpleasant that this company was really going down the tubes. And there wasn't really much I could do to save them, because if no one wants to buy their buses, then they pretty much just have to fire everybody. And so it was kind of a bleak experience. And I had this guy who was my translator who would go around with me everywhere. And I noticed one day that under his arm he had a newspaper with all these financial figures on it. And I stopped him and I said, what's on the newspaper there? And he looked at me and smiled very proudly and said, these are the very first privatizations in Poland. And I said, that's interesting. Could you tell me about them? And so we sat down in the conference room, and he laid the newspaper on the table. And I said, so what does this line say? And he says, well, that's the number of shares outstanding. And I said, okay. And what does this line say? And he said, that's the share price at which they're selling in the privatization. And so I did the math, and it was about $80 million, which meant that was the value of the company, the market capitalization of the company. And then I said, well, what's this line down here? And he said, that's the profits of the company. And I said, are you sure? He said, yeah, it says net profit of the company. And I said, this couldn't be. He said, no, that's what it says. And that number was $160 million. So now, you don't have to have a Stanford MBA to know that if you can buy a company at 1/2 of 1 year's earnings, that's a pretty good deal. And this really got me excited, and I looked at this whole situation, and I said, well, I'd never bought a share in my life before this, but I thought, isn't this what you're supposed to do when you go to business school, is like find things like this and buy shares? And so I decided to go all in. At the time, all in for me was $2,000. I made the investment, and the investment went up over the course of the next year 10 times. Now, I don't know how many of you here tonight have had an investment that's gone up 10 times, but for those of you who have, you'll know that it releases a certain chemical in your stomach. And you want to repeat the experience as much as possible. And so after that, I knew what I wanted to do with my career, which was to invest in privatizations in Eastern Europe. So fast forward a couple years, I end up at Salomon Brothers, the bank that was made famous by the book Liar's Poker. Doesn't exist anymore. I end up at Salomon Brothers as an investment banker on their East European team. And my very first assignment at Salomon Brothers was to advise the management of a fishing fleet located in Murmansk, the Murmansk trawler fleet, on the privatization. The management had the right to buy 51% from the government under the privatization program, and they had hired me to advise them. So I fly to Murmansk, which is a very hard place to get to. We have to go through St. Petersburg and then wait half the night in the airport, and then you finally get there early in the morning. The head of the fishing fleet comes and picks me up at the airport and takes me down to the docks so I can see one of their boats. And this fishing fleet had this. I went on the boat, and it's like a 300-foot factory vessel. On the top, they put the nets out to catch the fish, and then the fish go into some tubes, and then in the middle they separate out all the non-fish stuff that's caught up in the nets, and then after that they put them into cans at the lower level. And these are very, very enormous factory ships. And I said to the head of the fleet, how much does one of these ships cost? And he said, we buy them for about $20 million new. And I said, well, how many ships do you have in your fleet? He said, about 100. So $20 million times 100 gets you to $2 billion. And I said, what is the age of the fleet? And he said, it's about 7 years. So I figured, back of the envelope, that's about $1 billion worth of ships. And I said, well, what is the price at which the Russian government is selling the management the 51%? And he said, $2.5 million. Okay, so $1 billion worth of ships, and they can buy 51% for $2.5 million. Now, remember, I had this thing going on with my stomach. And the last thing I wanted to do was be advising these guys on this stuff. I wanted to be buying it myself. And so instead of going back to London, I went to Moscow from there and to try to investigate whether this was an anomaly with just the fishing fleet or whether there was something more broad going on. Now, I should point out that I didn't speak a word of Russian, and I didn't know anybody in Moscow. But I was so determined to figure out that I just went there. I got off the airplane, and at the airport they were selling an English language yellow page directory, very thin little directory of all the businesses that had some interest or people wanting to advertise to people speaking English. And so I bought that. I go to the hotel, and I start calling up people to figure out what's going on. And I had about 40 meetings with anyone who would meet with me to understand the privatization program. And at the end of the week, I discovered that the Russian privatization program was probably the single most compelling investment opportunity that has ever existed or will ever exist. And what I learned was that they had given away, as one part of the privatization program, they'd given away 150 million vouchers. For each person in Russia, they gave them a voucher. And these vouchers were exchangeable for shares of Russian companies. And they were freely tradable. So everybody got a voucher and they could keep it, they could exchange it for shares, or they could sell it. And they traded for about $20 each. And so again, I did the math, and $20 times 150 million vouchers gets you to $3 billion. And these $3 billion worth of vouchers were exchangeable for 30% of all the share capital of all Russian companies. So that meant that the market capitalization of Russia in that year, this was 1992, was $10 billion. Now this is a country with 35% of the world's natural gas, 10% of the world's oil, 10% of the world's aluminum, 10% of the world's steel, fertilizer, banks, telephone companies, electricity companies, timber, everything. The whole country, they were basically selling for $10 billion. Well, I was a man possessed. So I go back to Salomon Brothers, and and the first person I see, I said, we have to invest in Russia. And before I could even get into the math of why it was so cheap, the moment I said Russia, they looked at me like I was completely out of my mind. And I wasn't a particularly good corporate politician, and so I didn't understand how decisions were made, and I figured if one person said no, I'd just go to somebody else. So I go to the next person, I say, we have to invest in Russia. And again, they shut me down. And pretty soon, I went around to try to get anyone to listen to me, and pretty soon I became a complete pariah inside the firm. Even the young guys who I hung out with for drinks and lunch stopped inviting me out, and nobody wanted to have anything to do with this strange guy who was obsessed with investing in Russia, and they certainly didn't want to give me any capital to invest. And so I was getting towards the point of being fired because I wasn't making a lot of money for the firm, and I was at the same time talking all this crazy stuff about Russia. And I was probably about a month away from being fired when I get a call from a very senior partner in the New York office of Salomon Brothers who is responsible for investing the firm's own capital. And he calls me up and said, I hear you might have something interesting to say about Russia. Can you come to New York and explain it to me? So I spent a couple of days putting together a PowerPoint presentation on how cheap everything was in Russia. I go to New York. I started going through this presentation with this man. And about halfway through the presentation, he just gets up and leaves. And this was like my last sort of opportunity to save my career and potentially find some way to invest in Russia. And so I was really upset as he had left, and I think he didn't tell me why he was leaving, he just got up and left. And I was thinking, what do I have to say to this guy to get this meeting back on track when he comes back, because I'm sure he'll come back soon. And I was waiting for 10 minutes and 20 and 30 and 40, and about 45 minutes later he comes back into the office, and I'm about to like blurt out something to try to get this meeting back on track. But before I have a chance to say anything, he says, Bill, what you just showed me was the most amazing thing I've ever seen. I've just gone to the risk committee and I've got you $25 million to invest in the Russian stock market. So the weight's lifted off my shoulders. I go to Moscow. We invest the $25 million. This is now the fall of 1993. And then about 7 months later, The Economist magazine writes an article called Sale of the Century. And the magazine article basically describes the same math I've just taken you through right here, right now. And as a result of that, about 25 people show up who want to invest in Russia, hedge funds, rich guys, proprietary trading desks. And as a result of those 25 people showing up to buy Russian shares, the value of our $25 million portfolio goes up 5 times overnight. I make $100 million for the firm in 7 months. And this was back in the days when $100 million was real money. All of a sudden, the guys who had stopped inviting me to lunch and drinks were hanging around my desk in the morning waiting for stock tips on how to make 5 times their money. And the other thing which happened, which was very interesting, was that the most senior salespeople at Salomon Brothers started coming by my desk and saying, hey, Bill, I know you're really busy, but is there any chance you could make time to meet with George Soros to tell him about what was going on in Russia? You know, Bill, I know you're doing a lot of traveling, but is there any possible way when you're next in New York you could meet Julian Robertson and Michael Steinhardt? I was 29 years old, and I was being invited to meet the most important people on Wall Street, and everyone's wondering if I had enough time to meet them. So I go on this world tour of famous investors, and I share with them my presentation, the same one that I had given to my boss at Solomon, and they weren't as stupid as the original people at Solomon, and they all said, "Wow, this is amazing. Can we give you some money to manage?" And I said, "Well, I don't know, because we're just doing it for ourselves, but let me go back and ask the bosses." So I go back to London, to the boss on the trading floor, and I say, all these famous investors, George Soros and et cetera, they want to invest with us. Can we manage their money? And the boss on the trading floor says, "That's a great idea. Let's form a task force to study it." So I show up at the first task force meeting, and there were like 40 people in the room, and 38 of them I'd never seen in my life. There was like the vice chairman, the senior managing directors, junior managing directors, senior directors, senior vice president, all the way down to me. And these investment bankers it's a very interesting bunch of people. I've never met a group of people who can argue so articulately about why they deserve money when it has nothing to do with them. And all these different people started like really making these very persuasive arguments about why they deserved all the economic credit from this business. And it was just like a game of ping pong going back and forth between different people. And I wasn't sure who was going to win the argument, but I was pretty sure I knew who was not going to get any economic credit for the business. And that was going to be me. And so I get very upset by this whole thing, and I spent 3 days pacing around my apartment at night trying to figure out what I'm going to do, and I finally decided to quit. I quit Solomon Brothers. I set up my own company called Hermitage Capital, and I moved to Moscow. And one of the guys who I met on this world tour was a guy named Edmund Safra, who was the owner of Republic National Bank of New York. And he put up the first $25 million and became my business partner. And I started the Hermitage Fund in April of 1996. And I started the fund at a time when there was an election going on where Yeltsin was running for re-election, and it didn't look like he had great chances. And so a lot of people had sort of abandoned the market. If the communists had won, then he would renationalize everything. And so we got in before the election when the prices were really low. Yeltsin got together with the Russian oligarchs. They turned around the whole election situation. And in July 1996, Yeltsin was reelected. And over the next 18 months, my fund went up 865%. My fund went from $25 million of assets under management to more than $1 billion, which was a lot of money back then in Russia. I was the best performing fund manager in the world in 1997. Business Week, Financial Times, Time Magazine were all profiling me as a financial genius. My clients were sending their private jets to take me to their yachts to celebrate my success. And I was 33 years old. Now, any of these things would have been a great achievement by itself, but if you put all that together in the hands of a 33-year-old, in the parlance of Wall Street, that is the biggest sell signal there ever was. But I didn't sell. But what did happen was that 1998 hit in Russia. Many of you will remember that there was a huge economic crisis in which the Russians defaulted on their bonds. They devalued their currency by 75%. And I lost 900 million of the 1 billion that I had under management. Now, when you make 10 times your money, it releases a certain chemical in your stomach. When you lose 90%, it releases a different chemical. And I didn't feel particularly good about this, and I felt particularly bad about the fact that I had convinced all these people to invest with me, and I lost them a lot of money. And I was absolutely determined to fight my way out of this hole and to make the money back. I was going to do whatever it took. And it turned out that just as I was getting determined to make the money back, the Russian oligarchs, who own the majority shares of most of the companies that I invest in, were determined, since there was no longer any, Wall Street had pretty much closed for business for them, and they had no longer had any incentive to behave, they were determined to steal every last penny that was still left on the table. And so I ended up in a situation where if I wanted to recover my clients' money, I was going to have to go to war with the oligarchs. But I was so determined and so humiliated by what I had put everybody through that I was going to go to war with the oligarchs. And my most famous battle involved Gazprom, which is the largest gas company in the world. Gazprom in 1999 was trading at a 99.7% discount to BP and Exxon per barrel of reserves. Now, why was it so cheap? It was so cheap because everybody assumed in the market that every last cubic meter of gas had been stolen out of the company through some kind of scheme. And so I decided to do something that was never done before, which was a stealing analysis of Gazprom. Now, how do you do a stealing analysis? They don't teach this at Stanford Business School. I couldn't go to the management of Gazprom and say, sir, can you tell me how much you're stealing? Because they would not tell me, obviously, and maybe do worse things than that. I couldn't go to the investment banks that were doing the research on Gazprom because they were so busy trying to get consulting and paid investment banking work. The last thing they wanted to do is say anything that might badmouth Gazprom. And so what I decided to do was to set up meetings with people who knew about the stealing, ex-employees, customers, competitors, suppliers, etc. And I decided to I made a list of the people I thought knew about the stealing, and I invited all these people to breakfast, lunch, dinner, tea, coffee, dessert. And I didn't tell them my agenda in advance, I just invited them, and of the 40 people I invited, about 30 people said yes. So I went to have this series of meals with these people, and I discovered the most interesting thing about the Russian psychology, which was that during the Soviet times, the richest person in Russia was 6 times richer than the poorest person. Maybe they had a better apartment, a driver, a dacha, but there wasn't a dramatic difference in lifestyle. By 1999, the richest person in Russia was 250,000 times richer than the poorest person in Russia. And that kind of disparity of wealth, which was created over a 10-year period, poisoned the psychology of the entire nation. People were furious. And every one of these meetings, these people would tell me the most unbelievable things about stealing at Gazprom. And I was writing this stuff down. I was filling up notebooks after notebooks of all these incredible stories. The only problem was I had no idea how much of this stuff was true. It could have been sour grapes. It could have been exaggeration. It could have been just about anything. And so there I was trying to figure out, what do I do with all this information? And I couldn't figure out what to do with it until one day, about 3 weeks after we had completed our last interview, my head of research, a Russian PhD named Vadim, was at a traffic light at Pushkin Square. And Pushkin Square is a place where the traffic basically gets backed up from anywhere from 10 minutes to an hour. And as a result of that, this sort of outdoor market had been created among the cars by these street urchins, which they'd be selling pirated DVDs, cigarettes, everything, all beer. They were selling all sorts of stuff. And some kid comes up to his car and he rolls down his window and he said, "What do you have?" And the kid said, "I've got databases." And he said, "What kind of databases?" And the kid opens up his coat and he has this sort of collection of databases. And he said, "Well, for example, here I've got the Moscow Registration Chamber database, which shows the beneficial ownership of all Russian companies." And my head of research said, "Well, how much for that one?" He said, $5. So he bought it. He comes back to the office. He sticks it in the computer. And sure enough, it's the Moscow Registration Chamber database, which is something we needed to have to confirm all these rumors. And on top of that, there was a number on the disk so you can call to get other databases. So we called up and got all the databases. And we were able to prove definitively that the management of Gazprom, 9 individuals between 1996 and 1999, had stolen oil and gas reserves equal to the size of Kuwait. Now, if you remember, there was a war fought over oil and gas reserves the size of Kuwait called the Gulf War. And here we had just discovered, and nobody else knew it, that the management of Gazprom had done it under the nose of everybody in Russia. So that was pretty shocking. But the second most shocking thing, from an investment standpoint, is that oil and gas reserves the size of Kuwait only represented 9.65% of Gazprom's total reserves. So here's a situation where the market is valuing the company at a 99.7% discount because they thought everything is stolen. And we've just discovered that more than 90% is still there and hasn't been stolen. Now, as an investor, what do you do with that? Well, I'll tell you what we did. We backed up the truck. And I bought as much Gazprom as I could possibly buy in my fund within the rules of my fund. And after I did that, and that's, by the way, where most normal fund managers stop. But I thought this is just too interesting and too good. I need to share this information with the world. And so I took the dossier and I shared it with the Financial Times, the Wall Street Journal, Business Week, all the major newspapers. And they all wrote stories about this massive theft at Gazprom. And on the back of their stories, and the Russian press picked it up, on the back of that, then there were parliamentary debates about whether it was a good thing or bad thing for oil and gas reserves the size of Kuwait to be stolen from Gazprom. More articles. Then the management went out and hired PricewaterhouseCoopers to come up with a report to say it was a good thing to do this. And each time everybody did this, there was more articles. And by the end of this campaign, there were 500 articles written about all the theft at Gazprom. And then something really interesting happened. At the annual general meeting, about 7 months after we started this campaign, Putin stepped in, and he fired the CEO of Gazprom. And he replaced him with a guy whose mandate it was not to steal assets. Cash flow, yes. Assets, no. And on the day he made that announcement, the share price jumped 134%. And then it doubled again. And then it doubled again. And then it doubled again. And again. Between 1999 and 2005, the share price of Gazprom, which was my largest investment, went up 100 times. Now, as you can imagine, I felt pretty good about that. And so I did it again at the National Savings Bank. I did it at the National Pipeline Company, the National Electricity Company, 2 oil companies, etc. And I had a lot of success for a really funny reason, which was that Vladimir Putin became, without any conversation, my ally in this fight. I was fighting the oligarchs because they were stealing money from me, and when he became president, he was fighting the oligarchs because they were stealing power from him. The oligarchs had essentially privatized all the presidential power in Russia. And so every time I would publicize one of these scandals, Putin would step in. And so I had the most glorious life between 1999 and about 2004. And my $100 million, which was where I was at the bottom of the market, grew through appreciation and through new investors coming in to $4.5 billion. And I became the largest investor in Russia. And I was living the perfect life. I was making money hand over fist for my clients. I was getting the bad guys, and I was doing good. And there's very few jobs you can have in the world where you can make a lot of money and get the bad guys. I mean, you can become a cop if you want, but you don't make a lot of money. But to do these two things in the same job, it was truly gratifying. You could sort of cut through the esprit de corps in the air of my office. It was just so thick. But it was too good to be true. And in the fall of 2003, Putin decided to finish his war with the oligarchs by arresting the richest man in Russia, Michael Khodorkovsky, the owner of Yukos. He arrested him. He put him on trial in 2004. And they allowed the television cameras to film the richest guy in Russia sitting in a cage. And by doing so, it created this enormous psychological impact on everybody, all the remaining oligarchs. And they all went to Putin in the summer of 2004 and said, Vladimir, what do we have to do to make sure we don't have to sit in a cage? And he said, it's very straightforward, 50%. Not 50% for the Russian government or 50% for the presidential administration of Russia, but 50% for Vladimir Putin. And at that point, his interests and mine diverged. Now, I didn't realize this until I was flying back to Russia on November 13th, 2005, after living there for 10 years and becoming the largest foreign investor in their country. And I was stopped at Sheremetyevo Airport in the VIP lounge. 4 armed guards came into the lounge, grabbed me, took me down to the detention center of the airport, kept me there overnight, and then deported me the next day, and subsequently declared me a threat to national security. So at this point, I knew that when the Russian government turns against you, they don't do so mildly, they do so with extreme prejudice. And I decided that there was two places they had some leverage over me. One was I had people that could be arrested, and two, I had assets in the country. And so I evacuated my entire staff quickly and quietly, and I sold every last security I held in Russia. And I thought that was the end of the story. I dusted off my hands, and I thought, end of story. Well, it turns out that not to have been the end of the story, but the beginning of the worst nightmare you could ever imagine. About a year after that, in June of 2007, 25 police officers raided my office in Moscow. I kept my office there with one secretary. 25 police officers raided my office in Moscow. 25 more officers raided the office of my American law firm where I kept all of our corporate documents. And they were specifically looking for the stamps and seals and certificates of our investment holding companies, which were empty at the time because we had taken all of our money out. But they didn't know that. They found it at the law firm. And the next thing we found out was that we no longer owned our investment holding companies. Using the documents seized by the police, they had been fraudulently re-registered out of our name into the name of a man who had been convicted of murder and let out of jail early by the police. I was terrified, not for any economic reason, but for legal reasons. If the police were doing this, God knows what they were going to do next. And so I went out and hired the smartest lawyer I could find, a young man named Sergei Magnitsky, who worked for an American law firm. He was Russian, working for an American law firm. He was a 35-year-old lawyer, cleverest lawyer in Russia. And he went and investigated. And he came back from his investigation with two conclusions. One was that the first thing was they were trying to steal all of our money, which they didn't succeed in doing because we had taken all of our money out beforehand. But the second thing which he discovered they did succeed in doing, which was that when we were taking all of our money out of the country and selling all of our shares, we had a profit of $1 billion, and we paid $230 million of capital gains tax. And what these guys did was they went back to the tax authorities, and they said there was a mistake made in the previous year's tax filing. There was no profit, and therefore the $230 million was paid in error, and it should be refunded to them. They applied for a $230 million tax refund 2 days before Christmas, on the 23rd of December, 2007. And it was approved and paid out the next day, on Christmas Eve. The largest tax refund in Russian history paid out in one day, no questions asked. Well, we were absolutely convinced this was a rogue operation, and Sergei and I put together criminal complaints to all the different law enforcement agencies in Russia. I went to the press, and then Sergei testified against the police officers who did the raid at the Russian Investigative Committee, which is the equivalent of the FBI. And we waited for the good guys to get the bad guys. And we discovered shortly after that there are no good guys in the Putin regime in Russia. Instead of arresting the bad guys, they went and arrested Sergei Magnitsky on November 24th, 2008. They put him in pretrial detention, and then they began to torture him to get him to withdraw his testimony. They put him in cells with 14 inmates and 8 beds and left the lights on 24 hours a day to impose sleep deprivation. They put him in cells with no heat and no window panes in December in Moscow. He nearly froze to death. They put him in cells with no toilet, just a hole in the floor where the sewage would bubble up. They would move him from cell to cell to cell in the middle of the night. And they were doing all of this to try to get him to withdraw his testimony against the police officers and to get him to sign a false confession to say that he stole the $230 million, and he did so at my instruction. Now, I don't know how I would have behaved under these circumstances, and if you had asked Sergei in advance, he probably couldn't have told you how he would have behaved. But when he was faced with the idea of bearing false witness and perjuring himself, for him, the moral pain of doing that was greater than the physical pain he was subjected to, and he refused. And they were surprised because nobody refused. Everybody always buckles in these situations, but Sergei didn't buckle. And the real problem for Sergei was that as they continued to do this, his health deteriorated. And after about 6 months, he had lost 40 pounds. He had developed terrible pains in his stomach, and he was diagnosed as having pancreatitis and gallstones and needing an operation, which was scheduled for the 1st of August, 2009. 1 week before the operation, they came to him again with this false confession. Again, he refused to sign it. And then they abruptly moved him from the prison that had medical facilities to a maximum security prison with no medical facilities. They stuck him in this maximum security prison, and his health deteriorated very rapidly. He went into constant agonizing, terrible pain. and they refused him all medical attention. He and his lawyers applied in writing to every different branch of the criminal justice system of Russia for medical attention, and every one of the applications was either ignored or rejected. And on the night of November 16, 2009, Sergei Magnitsky went into critical condition. On that night, the prison officials decided to move him to a prison that had a hospital. They put him in an ambulance, but when he arrived at the prison with the hospital, instead of putting him in the emergency room, they put him in an isolation cell. They chained him to a bed, and 8 riot guards with rubber batons beat him until he died at the age of 37. That was November 16th, 2009, about a little more than 5 years ago. I got the news on the 17th of November in the morning, and it was the most heartbreaking, traumatic, life-changing news I could have ever gotten. Sergei Magnitsky was killed because he was my lawyer. He was 37 years old. He left a wife and 2 children. And for me, I just could not stand by and let that happen. And so from that moment on, I've put aside my commercial activities. I spent the last 5.5 years on a campaign to get justice for Sergei Magnitsky. And it shouldn't have been that hard for one very simple reason, because Sergei Magnitsky wrote everything down. He wrote 450 complaints during his 358 days in detention, documenting everything that happened. And as a result, we have the most granular, detailed record of human rights abuse that's come out of Russia in the last 35 years. And because of that, I figured that Putin and his regime would have to at least prosecute some of the mid-level people who tortured and killed him. But I was wrong. Putin didn't do that. Putin, in spite of evidence all to the contrary, Putin personally and publicly exonerated everybody involved. He gave state honors and promotions to some of the people most complicit. And the only 2 people who have ever been prosecuted in this whole affair was Sergei Magnitsky himself. 3 years after they killed him, they put him on trial in the first ever trial against a dead man in the history of Russia, and found him guilty. And they put me on trial as his co-defendant and sentenced me to 9 years in absentia. So it became obvious that there was no possibility of justice inside of Russia. And so I said, well, we need to create some justice outside of Russia. And so I looked around to see what kind of justice was available. And I discovered that there is no justice available for a terrible crime committed in a country like Russia. There is really no concept of international justice. But I was so upset and so moved by Sergei's death that I decided if there was none, that I was going to create some mechanism for international justice. And I looked around at what happened to Sergei, and I said to myself, this was not a crime of ideology or religion. This was a crime of money. And the people who did this crime, they don't like to keep their money in Russia. They like to keep it in America. They like to keep it in Britain. They like to keep it in Switzerland. And so I took this idea, and I went to Washington, and I met 2 senators. I met a Democrat from Maryland named Senator Benjamin Cardin, and I met a Republican from Arizona, Senator John McCain. And I told them the same story I've shared with you tonight. And I said, can we ban these people from coming to America and freeze their assets? And they said, yes, we can. And they introduced, in October of 2010, the Sergei Magnitsky Act. And they put it on the books. And all of a sudden, immediately after they did that, a bunch of Russian opposition politicians and Russian human rights activists came forward and said, you've hit the Achilles heel of the Putin regime. This is what they care about. And they said, can you add the people who killed my brother, my father, my aunt, my sister to your law? And after about 10 of these approaches, they decided to add 65 words to the law, which not only went after the people who killed Sergei Magnitsky, but who commit other gross human rights abuses in Russia. And the whole thing snowballed. And in November of 2012, it went for a vote in the Senate, and it passed 92-4. 89% of the House of Representatives voted in favor of the Sergei Magnitsky Act. And on December 14th, 2012, President Obama signed it into law. Now, the Magnitsky Act doesn't punish people. It's not proper justice for torture and murder. But it's a heck of a lot better than total impunity. And what it does to the people, there's now 32 people on the Magnitsky list. And these 32 people can't open a bank account anywhere in the world, because if you're on the US sanctions list, no bank will touch you. Some of their assets have been frozen. They can't travel to America. But most significantly, and this is what really terrifies them, is that everybody knows that the Putin regime is not going to last forever. everybody knows these terrible dictatorships eventually fall. And the people who work in these dictatorships, who commit these gross human rights abuses, do so with the comfort that when it all comes to an end, they'll flee to England or Canada, the United States, and ask for asylum. But in this particular case, if they flee, when they go to the British Home Office to do their asylum interview, the officer is going to have typed into the computer their name and say, wait a second, you're on the Magnitsky list for having committed gross human rights abuses. You can't have asylum here. We're going to send you back to Russia. And that's the most terrifying thing for these people to know, that there's no place to run to when it all comes to an end. So the Magnitsky Act it certainly doesn't bring Sergei back, but it does prick the bubble of impunity. We're working on a similar piece of legislation in Europe right now. And in January of this year, the same senators who proposed the Russian Magnitsky Act said, why do this just for Russia? And so there's now a piece of legislation going through Congress called the Global Magnitsky Act, which will impose visa sanctions and asset freezes on human rights abusers anywhere. In addition to doing that, the other thing I'm doing is telling the story, and I've just published this book called Red Notice. I see some of you have it on your tables out there. I wrote it in a way so that it's a popular book for people, even if you're not interested in Russia or finance or whatever. It's a page turner. But if you really want to change the world, and that's what I really want to do, the way you do it is through Hollywood. And so tomorrow, flying to Los Angeles to spend a month there to try to make a movie, or try to begin the process of making a movie about this. And so I can't tell you who's going to play me. But hopefully in about 2 years' time, you can go to the cinema or perhaps watch it on Netflix and see this whole story on the widescreen. Thank you very much. Thank you. I'm very there's a lot of questions that always come up, and I'm very happy to answer those questions for as much time as they'll let me answer them. And I think there's 2 microphones. I don't know where they are. There's one over there and one over there. So why don't we start with that one with that gentleman?
Hi, my name's Tane Danger. That is an incredible story, and thank you so much for sharing it. You started this story talking about this, a lot of the path that you ended up taking being a reaction or some relationship with your family and your family's history. And I'm wondering if your interpretation or your understanding of your family and where that comes from has changed, or has any of this changed the way that you think about your family's background and history?
That's a good question, a very psychological question. Absolutely. I mean, I've gone from being a hedge fund manager to human rights activist, and there's not very many people who would do that. And I don't think I would have done it if I hadn't come from this family where this kind of sort of righteous indignation sort of pulses through our veins. And people always ask me, what would your grandfather think of you? And probably he wouldn't have been too happy when I was out there hedge funding, but he'd probably be pretty happy that I was out there trying to poke the bad guys in the eyes right now. And so there's definitely the Hollywood people love this story because there's this sort of character development. So what you've why don't we do one on that side? Any hands on that side? We got one right here. Hold on one second. She's going to bring you the microphone.
Do you think there's any authenticity to the Russian courts threatening to deny the constitutionality of the separation of the Baltics? I believe I've heard that very recently, and I think that's very worrisome.
Well, so what's going on right now is that as time has gone on, this whole thieving that Putin was doing, this 50%, which has accumulated about $200 billion of value into his own hands, that's no longer acceptable to the Russian people. So they started to grumble and get angry with him. And in order to, and this is something that leaders do through time and history, if people are angry at them, they try to create somebody else to be angry at. And so what Putin has done is created a foreign enemy, which started with Ukraine and is sort of the West and the EU as well. But it's not going to stop at Ukraine. And so they're now meddling with the Baltics. They also, have talked about reversing the, I think it's 1913 independence of Finland. We laugh, but I published my book in Finland, and I was talking to my publisher, and I think 1 out of every 4 young men is in the Army Reserve now, training to defend them against the Russians. And I mean, for anyone who thinks that Russia is not the single largest threat to world peace, they don't know all the facts. This is a dangerous, dangerous man doing a lot of dangerous stuff. And my story, people used to think that I was some kind of isolated incident. What they've discovered, what I've discovered, what everyone's discovered, is that I was the canary in the coal mine. That this was something that what happened to me was just a small precursor to what's happening with the world. And we have a man who is a mafia boss, who's stolen a lot of money, who's terrified of losing power, who's ready to do anything to stay in power, including using a nuclear arsenal if that's what it takes, and that's terrifying. Okay, how about this man in the red?
Thank you. So, thank you so much. Why isn't our government putting some of the people in Russia that are responsible for the Ukrainian invasion, whatever you want to call it, on this same list?
Well, the answer is they are. So after the Magnitsky Act was passed, Russia invaded Ukraine, and they took the Magnitsky Act and replicated it for people who are invading Ukraine. And there's a number of people who are on that list. I think it's about 100 people, maybe less. However, our government, and it's not just the United States government, it's also the European governments, are all very scared of Vladimir Putin. And there's a psychology of appeasement. People are saying, well, we don't want to do that because we don't want to enrage him further. And it's really similar to the psychology of a battered wife saying with a vicious alcoholic husband who says, I don't want to say anything that might make him violent. And I believe that's the wrong approach. I think that the only way to deal with Vladimir Putin is with strength and to show him that if he does stuff, that there'll be bad consequences. But that's not the current psychology of our government and other governments. And as a result, we're taking a step too late each time in preventing him from doing stuff. And we just heard about the Baltics. And if Russia does invade the Baltics, we have a treaty obligation under NATO. It's called Article 5 of NATO, to go to war with Russia to protect the Baltics. Or we can abrogate the treaty and let Russia just run riot over Europe. And that's a pretty scary thought. How about over here?
Just a quick question. What happened to Sergei's wife and children?
That's the most important question. Sergei's wife and children are outside of Russia. They're in London. They're safe. They're being looked after by me and my colleagues. About right over there.
I'm sitting here wondering, you would seem to be at significant risk. We've heard,
Yeah.
people with, mysterious disappearances in London, deaths, like, what's keeping you from, disappearing?
Well, the answer is that I'm sure that they would love to disappear me if they could get away with it. And so it's a question of whether they can get away with it. It does help me to speak publicly at the Aspen Institute and other places. It helps me to have a book that everyone reads. It'll help me to have a movie so that if something does happen to me, that we'll know who did it. That's the only thing that can protect me. There's no army of bodyguards that can protect me if they want me dead. And at some point they may do that, but that is that's the path I've chosen. So we'll see. Hopefully I can survive, and you can all pray for me and buy my book Okay. How about in the very back over there?
Hi, just a technical question. How is it that you actually were able to so quickly wire the funds of all the holding companies? The assets were not custodied themselves in Moscow? How did that work? Because I would think that they would clamp down on that as soon as it's possible.
It's interesting. A lot of people ask me that question. Putin regime is evil, but they're not very competent at implementing their evil. They just have bad people working for them, and because good people don't want to work for them. And so we owned publicly traded shares in Russia, and we had from November 2005 until July 2006, we had all that time to sell everything, and we sold everything, and they didn't do anything. It took until 2007 before they raided the offices, and it took them that long, and so we were able to get our stuff out. Now, a lot of people just don't. A lot of people, when they get into situations like this, just don't think terrible things can happen, and so they just leave their stuff there, and they're the ones who end up getting into trouble.
But aren't there currency controls that prevent you from taking money out of the country?
So the question is, aren't there currency controls? And the answer is there are no currency controls in place in Russia at the moment. There may be in the future. I actually predict there will be, but there weren't certainly when I was trying to get the money out, and so I was able to get it out fair and square.
How about 2 more questions?
2 more questions. Okay, let's. How about the lady in red over here?
It's an incredible story. It's a remarkable story. Your courage and your commitment to following up on this is really, really amazing and wonderful. I'm wondering, though, you have criticized the U.S. and Europeans for not taking Putin on. What would be your idea as to what would be the best ways? You obviously were very creative in this instance, and I'd be really interested in knowing your thoughts on how you would deal with that. And I have a whole list of other people I'd like to put right behind him.
Well, basically, I believe that the way to stop Putin is to take his resources away to make trouble. And so the way you take his resources away is, first of all, to do what they did with Iran. So there was like 20 years worth of Iran sanctions that didn't do anything. And then one day, the United States and Europe came up with a very simple sanction which brought them to the table within 18 months, which was to unplug Iran from the international banking system by denying them the use of SWIFT, the international payment system. If we do that to Russia, that within 18 months, they will have run out of money, and they will come back and negotiate a détente, a stopping of their nastiness. The other thing I would do is that since all the money of Putin is held in the hands of Russian oligarchs, I would go after the top 100 Russian oligarchs in the West and freeze their money. And the last thing I would do is I would provide arms to Ukraine. Ukraine is fighting a terrible battle with 20th century weapons against Russia with 21st century weapons. And Ukraine is ready to be at war with Russia to defend their homeland, and we should be ready to provide them weapons. And at the moment, it's still very, very much a controversial subject. We have one more question. We'll do it on this side of the room. This gentleman right here in the front.
You mentioned very succinctly that Putin would go nuclear to save himself. Would you expand on that?
Well, so Putin is a sociopath. He doesn't have any capacity to look at consequences, the human consequences of his actions. And Putin also understands all he cares about is himself, and he has no exit strategy. He can't resign from being president. He can't leave because he knows that if he leaves, all of his money will be taken away, he'll be put in jail, and he might be killed. And so for him, it's a mortal imperative to stay in power. And because of that, and because he fears for his own life, he's ready to do just about anything. He created a war. He manufactured an enemy in the next door country and is killing thousands of people to stay in power. And he's ready to kill a lot more than 1,000 people if that's what it takes. And if it comes to it, I mean, I could envisage him taking a tactical nuclear weapon and sending it to a country that doesn't have any weapons and is not part of NATO, and killing a few 100,000 people, and then having the whole world look at him and say, "Oh my God," and everybody just becomes paralyzed at doing anything with Putin. I could imagine him doing that. He's that crazy, and I don't want to ruin your Friday night here, but that is the truth. That this is a very evil man who has nuclear weapons, and doesn't care about anybody. He's ready to kill his own citizens in large numbers for a lot of different reasons, and he'll kill whoever he needs to, including using nuclear weapons. Sorry to end it on such a terrible note, but there's a jazz concert afterwards, so.